So this is where we're going to start. And we're going to just go ahead and start off with just general information about the AP exam. And then I'll move into evolution. Anybody who misses this live can go ahead and watch it afterwards. You'll get the same information. And hopefully if there's any questions after the fact, please just leave a comment and I'll try to get to those in a future video. So, all right. So tonight, for anyone who is not my student and might be watching this, just a little bit about me. I'm Linda Carell and I teach at Kettle Run High School in Oaksville, Virginia. My Twitter handle is Carell Science, and this is my new and improved YouTube channel. So we'll see how this goes. I don't have a custom handle yet, but hopefully eventually maybe I can build that. So, all right, the AP biology exam is really not a secret. This is nothing that you can't look up on the internet, but just to make everything clear, it's a long test. It's 3 hours long, which is kind of painful. It has 2 parts and each section is 50% of your overall score. So the first section, section 1, is the multiple choice, which is followed by 6 grid ends. There's 63 multiple choice and you have 90 minutes to do all 69 questions. So you do not have a ton of time to do any of this. You have to really know your answers. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. The grid ends are math-based. They're generally questions about things like calculating Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, slope, and other stuff like that. So watch out for those. They tend to be a little tricky, but sometimes they're really, really easy, low-hanging fruit. You just got to watch out. Section 2 is the free response section. It takes 10 minutes to read, and during the time that you're reading, you may write as much as you like. They don't care. And then there's an 80-minute actual writing section. So technically, you sort of have 90 minutes to write. However, I encourage you to kind of organize your thoughts before you get writing, because if you just launch into like question 1, you might waste a lot of time that you might be able to get a 3 or 4 or a 7 or an 8 answered before then. So section 2, the free response is 8 questions long. There are 2 questions that are longer than the others. Question 1 and question 2 are always notoriously long. And one of those is always a lab or data-based question. Typically it's interpreting data or making a graph or something like that. And then there are 6 short questions, which are very straight and to the point usually, although they may involve scenarios you've never heard of before. And that's okay. That's totally fine. It's based on information that you might know. And a lot of it's just straight up problem solving. But those last 6 tend to be slightly more straightforward than those first 2. The first 2 are very convoluted, and they just kind of want to see if you can process an experiment or a big scenario of information. So just a couple tips. These aren't any secrets. They're just, over the years of watching kids, this is what I've seen. My tips for the multiple choice and the grid in section. So section 1 is that you always need to move very quickly. You don't have time to sit there and kind of look at the answers and think about the answers and try to cross out the wrong ones. You don't have time for that. You need to move on. So what I encourage a lot of my kids to do is to go ahead and cover up your answers. Don't even look at the answers until you've had a chance to read the question. And as soon as you formulate an answer, look to see if it's on the list. Because another thing with AP is their distractors are so good. All the practice questions I've seen, like every answer for someone who doesn't know the answers like securely sounds amazing, and you'll find yourself just sitting there trying to narrow it down. That is not the way to work on an AP exam. You need to be confident. You need to know the answer. If you don't know the answer, and this is the third point here, you need to skip it. But before you skip, don't put a star, don't put a question mark, write a possible letter. Because if you don't even try to give yourself a possible answer before you skip, later if you try to fill in, you won't know what to put there. So always take a quick look at the grid ends. You have to ask yourself, are they worth your time? They're worth exactly the same amount as a multiple choice question. So if it's a question that's going to take you 5-10 minutes to do, it's not something that's going to be worth your time. These are supposed to be quick equation questions. But if you're not as familiar with the equation or you're not as comfortable with the information, then this probably isn't for you. Don't be afraid, don't be sad to skip them. A lot of people do. If you skip, again, write some sort of an answer, because when they call 5 minutes, 10 minutes left, if you still have multiple choice questions unanswered, please just put something. Take a guess, because you won't receive anything for a blank answer. But if you guess wrong, they won't take any points away from you. You just won't get any. In the old days, the AP exam used to actually take points off for incorrect answers, kind of like the old SAT. That's not true anymore. So make sure that you fill in something. And if you've gone through and you've put a possible answer for each question, you have a better shot. Another thing that usually throws kids off, several of the questions during the first section are actually in groups. There's a huge piece of information and then 6 or so questions, 5 or 6 questions that are related to that chunk of info. Kids get hung up on it. They're hard to read. They're kind of taxing. And so my suggestion to you is, if you run into a group of questions and it's maybe not a topic you love, or you're just feeling like you're bogged down, skip it. Skip the whole set. It's just not worth it. Get all the singleton questions, all the standalone questions first, and then come back and do that big batch. Okay? You don't have a lot of time. That's the problem. All right, good news is this year you can finally have a graphing calculator. Ooh. Seriously, this has been a big deal for a long time. Graphing calculators were not allowed on the AP bio exam until this year. We've always been stuck with the infamous 4 function that no one likes. The problem with that is that some of the equations are easier done on a graphing calculator, and a lot of you are more familiar with a graphing calculator than you are a 4 function. I like it too, because now I don't have to have all these 4 functions calculators laying around my room. So, but anyway, if your school doesn't provide one, Kettle Run absolutely will have one for you. But if you're watching this and you don't go to Kettle Run, make sure you bring a calculator for yourself, just in case. It'll have to be cleared. So if it's something you're really attached to, you might want to think twice about that. But yeah, this is the first year that a graphing calculator is at your disposal. Nobody knows what that's going to do. The math may be different because now they know you have a better graphing device. So some tips for section 2. This is the part that always makes everyone nervous. The 8 questions, and there's no multiple choice here. While they're trying very hard to get you to pick a certain answer, if you know it, this can be the section that just totally throws kids for a loop. They have no idea what to do. So first off, I'm just going to tell you, if you're feeling nervous when you start to read this section during the reading time, if you're panicking, you start reading question 1, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know anything. I never learned anything ever. I suggest that you go read questions 6, 7, and 8 first. Don't start with question 1 and 2. They're the hardest questions on the test. They have the most information and the most parts. So go read 6, 7, and 8, and chances are between the 3 of those, you'll feel a little bit better about yourself. If those don't work, try 3, 4, and 5. But generally, 6, 7, and 8 tend to be short questions that are very, very poignant on what they're trying to get you to say. For the free responses, always answer question number 1 and 2. Even if you can't get all the parts, any of the parts is important. They have the most points attached to them. They're 10 points each. And if you don't answer them, it's really tough to recover from those missing points. Really, really frustrating if those ones are blank. So other things, you can always answer any section of the free response out of order. No one cares. It's fine. Just make sure that you label the free response. Write A parentheses, B parentheses, something, so that the reader has some clue where you're supposed to be starting. Each question has its own page to write on, or pages in some cases. But as long as you're within that couple of pages that you're allowed to write, you can start A, B, C, D, E. It doesn't matter. Just make sure you're clear where you're starting. The biggest thing I tell my students is you always need to get to the point to get the points. In these questions, there is a very simple expected answer typically. The rubric is usually very straightforward on these. There's a little bit of wiggle room, but for the most part, they're trying to get you to say something. And the way they prompt you is, if you haven't looked at free response questions, there's a bold word. The bold words can be things like predict, analyze, describe, construct. And what that means is they're trying to get you to do something. Each one of those bold words is worth a point. So what I find is kids start to just ramble. I mean, never, ever, ever start an AP Bio essay by restating the question. That's ridiculous. Start answering immediately. And as soon as you've answered, stop. Because the more that you ramble and try to sound like you know a thing, the more likely you are to lose your points because you're going to say something wrong. In the AP exam on section 2, any contradiction removes a point you've received. So that's not really something you want. Other things, if you can't remember a vocabulary word, oh man, what's that thing that we talked about in class? And it's where the organisms, if they have good traits, then they survive and they pass them on. If you can't remember exactly what the term is, it doesn't matter as long as you describe it. If you can define it, if you can give us some evidence of you know what you're talking about, then chances are you can get around that vocabulary word. And then the last thing is about math. So question 1 or 2 usually contains some sort of a math-based thing. It could be anything. What you have to ask yourself, though, you have to calm down and breathe, and you have to say, do I really have to do any math? Are they asking me for a calculation? If it doesn't say calculate in bold, chances are you don't. Chi-square is really bad about this, that they don't necessarily even want you to calculate chi-square. They just want to make sure you can interpret chi-square. So don't immediately launch into making some crazy mathematical thing because it may not even be what they're asking. Be really careful. Look for that word calculate and then go ahead. Usually they'll provide you some sort of a table or something so that you know what the heck you're supposed to be calculating. All right. Other tips. These are just general tips. They're not tied to any particular section or any particular thing about the AP exam. So the first one is going to be to get some sleep and eat breakfast. That's the key thing. If you're a nervous test taker, you need to calm down, do some yoga or something, make yourself comfortable. Because if you go into this test tired and jittery and hungry, it's a long haul. You're going to be very fatigued by the end. You're going to be miserable and you're going to be more likely to try to give up. And it's like running a marathon. Like you have to prepare yourself. Big one, don't panic when you see something that you haven't seen before. It doesn't mean that you don't know anything. It doesn't mean that your teacher didn't teach you. The AP exam is more about knowing what you can do than what you know. So a lot of the test now is about application. They'll give you a completely novel situation, something you've never seen. But buried in that novel situation is something you understand, hopefully, that you've picked up. So even though it might seem like a big, scary new experiment, and you're like, I don't even know what this is, that's not the point. The point is that you've seen something that will lead you to the correct answer. On the free response questions, you can always answer something. The worst thing you can do is just mentally shut down and be like, I can't do anything, and then just quit. That's not how this works. On the free responses, you can always try to do something, anywhere, anything, any section, it doesn't matter. Just give it a shot, give it a try. All right, so here's the real thing everyone's waiting for. Real quick, I'm gonna ask again, if you're viewing right now, over in the chat window, can you please make sure to mention whether or not you can hear me, since I can't hear myself. So if you're watching this on YouTube, there should be a little chat window, and I would really appreciate it if you let me know. All right. So evolution part 1, I've divided this into 2 parts because in my head, all the Darwinian evolutionary stuff really doesn't belong with some of the stuff we're going to talk about tomorrow. So I try to keep the 2 separate in my brain, and so that's why I went ahead and did it this way. We probably could have done it all in one shot, but I just figured it might be nice to try to split it up. So let's start with Darwin, the man himself. Oh, wait, no, we're going to do origin of life. We're actually not going to launch into what you think of as evolution for a minute. We're going to kind of start with this beginning of everything idea. The origin of life is an interesting topic. It's fairly controversial, and there's a lot of information out there that we're still just learning. But basically, what you're expected to know is the origin of life follows a pretty predictable sequence of events. It follows a pretty understandable sequence. So first thing that had to happen was there had to be, so remember, Earth is like this rocky, angry ball 4.5 billion years ago. And eventually it kind of cools down a little bit. But in the meantime, something happened. And we don't 100% understand. You may have heard of the Miller-Urey experiment or the Oprah and Haldane experiment, but basically something happened in that early atmosphere that allowed for the production of the earliest organic molecules, things like carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids. You can actually recreate these to an extent in a lab. You can make amino acids pretty quickly, which are the precursors to proteins, just by mixing the right gases with water vapor and some sort of a spark or a reducing environment like a volcano. So anyway, once we had organic molecules, things like phospholipids, which if you remember are part of the cell membrane, when you drop phospholipids into water, they naturally form a little bubble anyway. And so if one of those were to, if a group of those were to form a bubble, what stops another molecule from getting trapped inside that bubble that has the ability to do something? Enzymes are not living things. Enzymes are proteins. Well, who says that an early protein blob couldn't, a bunch of amino acids couldn't have started reacting? RNA can actually act basically like an enzyme, ribozymes. So those things are really, really, really easy to happen on their own. What's amazing, though, is if all this really assembled on its own. An alternative theory is that the first cells came here from somewhere else, but we don't really fully know exactly how they got here. But what's important is once we had organic molecules, we picked up cells. And the very first cells in life would have been prokaryotic, little tiny, no nucleus, no major organelles. Our evidence of this is to the right. If you look over here, there's this image right here, and those are stromatolites. Stromatolites are believed to be basically like mats of bacteria, early bacteria. Sometimes they'll refer to them as cyanobacteria. So speaking of cyanobacteria, these were little photosynthetic bacteria. We still have them, and they worked to perform photosynthesis. And by doing that, it actually increased the previously oxygen poor environment to a higher oxygen environment, which would have helped. That would have helped change climate and how organisms could survive. Metabolic processes changed to using oxygen instead of just using other chemicals. Some organisms never evolved past that. A lot of our archaeans and our really, really primitive bacteria don't tolerate oxygen well because they probably evolved in a time where there was no oxygen and they never moved on from that phase. So once we have prokaryotes and once we have photosynthesis, somewhere in that order, it might be a little different, we pick up eukaryotes. So I'm going to talk more about them in just a minute, but eukaryotes are these larger, more complex cells. They started packaging their DNA into a nucleus. They started putting other processes into little bags called organelles, and that made everything a little more efficient as that cell is getting larger and doing more things. Once we have eukaryotes, we pick up multicellular organisms. It's not hard to think of a bunch of eukaryotes that start working together and become dependent on each other. We actually see this in Protista a little bit, because you'll get what are known as colonial protists, organisms where the cells work together but haven't fully evolved into a multicellular organism. The Cambrian explosion, woo! Under the water, all of these organisms in the fossil record just appear. Just all these weird crustacean-y, buggy-looking things. In the picture down here, you can see all these weird things that look vaguely like shrimp and snails and cockroaches and all this other stuff. And there was just this explosion of diversity in the fossil record. And we don't know exactly what caused it. Or it honestly, was there stuff before that and it just didn't preserve? We really aren't positive. But anyway, there's this Cambrian explosion and then it kind of trims back. And then there's all these changes that occur. Life moves onto land. Plants and fungi would have been first. Then we pick up fish that turn into amphibians, not literally, but fish that are starting to grow legs that are almost, or fins that are almost like legs. And we have the move from fish to amphibians to reptiles. Then we pick up all these other crazy things. Down the line, we pick up, teeny tiny mammals. And meanwhile, the dinosaurs just rise and fall for this enormous amount of time. So it's funny, like we just don't even realize how long all of this took. Humans have literally been here. Here we are, humans. We have literally been here for a blink of an eye. We play the smallest role in all of this, but we sat down and thought about it. So for those of you who have me, you already know about this, but if anyone's watching this who doesn't have me, I highly, highly recommend this video. This is the history of the entire world, I guess. This is actually the clean version. I highly, highly recommend the first couple minutes because he starts off with the Big Bang and how Earth came to be, and he works all the way up to man. And it keeps going after that. If you have an AP history exam, it might be helpful for that. But it is pretty cool. Like he walks all the way through all the different types of organisms and all that time. So there's lots of cool other ways to see this, like timelines. So down here, you have the origin of the Earth, then you have the Earth cooling, you go through, hey, there's life, and then life gets more complex, and we have oxygen and more complex, and oh my gosh, multicellulars. And as you move through, eventually, I mean, dinosaurs, man, they don't even look that impressive on here. And then humans at the very, very end. I mean, just nothing. There's some really cool analogies out there using like human hands and trying to figure out, and like literally you are the very end of a fingernail in the time. So it's really pretty crazy. This is just kind of a little chart. We're going to talk about these in the next session tomorrow, but this is basically kind of like an early tree or cladogram trying to explain how life branched off. But you can see here's animals all the way at the end. We were very late to the game. And again, humans were absolutely the latest to the game. All right, so prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. I mentioned this on the last on the slide about origin of life, and I feel like I kind of need to give this a little justice. So remember, just good vocab. Prokaryotic cells, we believe, evolved first. They're smaller, they're simpler, and their DNA is not contained in a nucleus. Examples of prokaryotes would be bacteria and archaea today. Very, very simple, very, very small, like crazy small. Eukaryotic cells evolved a lot later. They were larger, they started packaging things, they had more components and more action. And so they needed ways to separate all those components from each other. My students know I usually compare this to a eukaryotic cell is like a suitcase that you're packing for 2 weeks. You carefully package your shampoo in bottles, and you put your toothbrush in a toothbrush holder, and you keep that in a toiletry bag. And then the toiletry bag is separate from your dirty clothes, which is separate from your clean clothes. Maybe you don't pack like that, but I know like in a family of 4, typically everyone wants their own stuff in a different place. On the other hand, prokaryotic cells are more like a little beach bag. You're going to the beach for the day, so you throw your flip-flops and a towel and your sunglasses in, and you don't even think twice about the fact that they're touching. So don't be fooled. Prokaryotes do have their DNA in one place. It's called a nucleoid space, but it's not defined by a membrane. They just never really needed one. Mostly, they don't have that much DNA. It's far smaller than ours. I'll talk about that in a future session, where meanwhile, our DNA had to fit into this little tiny orb here to make sure that it was safe to protect it. We have a lot more DNA than a bacterium. So remember, if you get confused, which one's a prokaryote, which one's a eukaryote? Pro is before. So these are the very primitive organisms. And then eukaryote, U is true, you are a eukaryote. That's the easiest way to remember. So real quick, since we're talking about prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and we're talking about the origin of life, evolution of cells is an important concept. And one of the things we need to talk about is endosymbiotic theory. So endosymbiotic theory is a concept that basically, step 1, an ancient eukaryotic cell ate or engulfed a smaller prokaryote. I have both being shown here. The orange ones and the green ones are being eaten by this cell. Step 2, instead of digesting this tasty little prokaryotic morsel, the eukaryote kind of kept it around. Nobody knows exactly why, what the event was that led to that, but it's pretty crazy to think that it happened that way. Step 3, over time, the prokaryote lost most of its function except energy reactions, which were used to support itself and the host. So it actually started feeding that eukaryote. And in exchange, the host made sure, well, not feeding, but giving energy to the host. And in exchange, the host shuffled food to it. If the prokaryote that was engulfed is a cyanobacteria, blue-green bacterium, then the organelle that came out of that is known as a chloroplast. If the prokaryote that was ingested is an alpha proteobacterium, then, and this is non-photosynthetic, just heterotrophic, then that organelle became the mitochondrion. And this couldn't have happened too many times. Like, this had to be a pretty unique event. But what we'll talk about later is this idea that if something works, it's more likely to get passed down. And in this case, these were so good and so important that over time, they became basically part of almost every cell on Earth except for bacteria and archaea. So pretty crazy to think. Like, whew. Now, obviously, we don't have chloroplasts, but mitochondria are found in every eukaryote. And so that leads a lot of people to believe this idea that this mitochondria first theory, that they probably came around first, and then the chloroplast was later, since they're only found in plants and algae. So if you don't believe me and you want some evidence that the endosymbiotic theory, that this event actually occurred, check out things like the size and shape of mitochondria. They're about exactly the same as bacteria. These organelles have double membranes, probably the original membrane plus the host's vesicle. And they carry bacteria-style DNA, little circular DNA chromosomes, which are independent of the host. They have genes that the host can't transcribe and translate. They have their own proteins that are only found in them, that are specifically helpful for things like cellular respiration and photosynthesis. And then finally, they actually divide on their own, which is really crazy. The host cannot make mitochondria or chloroplasts. It's just the mitochondria and chloroplasts make new ones. So pretty nuts. That's part of the reason why, if you want to think about it, all of your mitochondria came from your mother, because only the egg cell provides mitochondria in the beginning. All of your mitochondria have evolved or have divided from that original couple mitochondria. So kind of insane, kind of a cool history thing. All right. So now we're going to get to the Darwin stuff. This is what everyone kind of thinks of when they think of evolution. And this part should go pretty quick. So natural selection, which is also known as survival of the fittest, was a concept that Darwin got most famous for, but remember also Wallace and some others helped with this idea. Darwin's name is attached to it. Perfect time, perfect place. Survival of the fittest describes this idea known as fitness. And fitness doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. Fitness is the ability to survive and make babies. So basically, you can be strong and amazing and live for a really long time, but if you make no kids, your fitness is zero, according to evolutionary theory. And that's a hard concept, because usually when we think of survival of the fittest, we think of the biggest and strongest, but it doesn't have to be. Survival of the fittest, natural selection, assumes that there are more individuals around in a population than can survive without or with just the available resources. So it assumes that some individuals aren't going to make it. And it also assumes that some individuals will be born with variations that could help or hurt their survival. So that's going to be things like random mutation, especially in asexually reproducing organisms. In sexual reproduction, that's going to be meiosis, independent assortment, whatever you have. So the mixing of the chromosomes is going to give brand new combinations, which could lead to brand new adaptations that could help an organism survive and reproduce, attract mates, and things like that. So basically, summing up evolution, if you're born a little different, is that different good? Well, if it is, yay, then you should live a long time and make more babies like you. Now, is that always the case? No. Plenty of good ideas in evolution have probably gone by the wayside just because that organism didn't succeed. So again, fitness is defined as survival, but also reproductive success. So just like if you're strong and can't find a mate, then you're not really very fit. Is natural selection perfect? We have this misconception, the idea that evolution leads to perfection. It doesn't. A lot of times it's very imperfect. It's whatever's around that works. So it can kind of fail sometimes. And especially if there's another change, another pressure, natural selection can only get you so far. So some common misconceptions in evolution that pretty much drive me crazy. Individuals cannot evolve. It's too late for you. You've already been born. You have your defined characteristics, your defined traits. This is as good as it gets. If you're successful, cool. If you're not, you're not. So in evolution, like, you can't sprout wings because you want to. It doesn't work that way. Just like an organism, any species can't evolve something based on want or need. Just because all of a sudden the climate drops doesn't mean that everyone can sit around and wish for fur. It doesn't work that way. The fittest organism is not always the biggest, strongest, or prettiest. Like, we just assume like the peacock with the biggest tail is going to win. Well, not necessarily. If that big tail slows him down and a predator eats him first, he's not going to mate. So that's not going to work out. The prettiest songbirds are often far too skewed for mates. Their mates often won't pick them if they're too far. We talked a little bit in class about bluegills. I had talked to someone who was an expert in them. Bluegills. We think of bluegill males as the parental males, these big peacock males, but in fact, some of the most successful males in the bluegill fish population are the males that pretend to be females, or the males that sneak in while the other male's not watching, little tiny males. And so while they're not big or strong or pretty, they're very successful because they've found an adaptation. They have been selected through selective pressures to make the most babies. Not all evolution is perfectly linear. Sometimes evolution goes off in multiple directions at the same time. There's this classic image, and I grabbed it up here, the one of the chimp turning into the walking ape, and then it goes up into humans. It doesn't work like that. Those things are not ancestral. Chimps and apes are completely just branches in our family tree. It doesn't work like that. Not all evolution is slow. I've actually got a slide about that coming up. And evolution does not have to occur at a constant rate. It can be all over the place. It can go in little bursts, and nothing can happen for a really long time. And finally, my favorite misconception: man did not come from monkeys. No one said that. Ugh, this drawing, ugh, it's so gross. That is not how it worked. We share a distant common ancestor with what we see today as the great apes. But yeah, there's no man came from monkeys thing. That's not really a thing. All right, so not all evolution is slow. Want to watch evolution real time? Well, find an organism with a short reproductive cycle. Moths, guppies, and bacteria all reproduce from minutes to days to weeks. So pick something that you can actually watch have many generations in your lifetime, and you'll probably see evolution happen. Next, take that organism with a short life cycle or short reproductive cycle and give it a challenge. Give it a new predator, give it a new climate, give it antibiotics, give it no camouflage, whatever it is that might cause some of them to die and those that are unique to survive. And then just sit back and watch it happen. A lot of you are probably familiar with this picture down on the bottom right. This is the pepper moth. So the white moth had an advantage on birch trees, or whatever kind of tree this is, on the tree, because they were lightly colored. They were camouflaged. And meanwhile, the birds were picking off the other ones because they could see them. You can see them in this picture really easily. Well, now take the Industrial Revolution, darken all the trees with soot, and all of a sudden, the darker moth has the advantage. The white moth sticks out, and the birds pick those off. And the gene frequency actually changed. When humans cleaned up their act and the trees became white again, guess who had the edge? Back to the white moths. So there's a video that came out not too long ago from Harvard, where you can actually watch bacteria evolve real time, not sped up, but over 11 days. They took bacteria from no antibiotic resistance to extreme antibiotic resistance. It's an amazing video. You can actually watch as multiple mutants go on and have babies, and it creates multiple strains of highly resistant bacteria in real time. Like crazy. So here's an example. And if you're watching at home, this is something to think about. So one of the most famous examples of evolution that humans have witnessed is guppies. Guppies have a really short life cycle, and they make a lot of babies. So in the wild, guppies have two major predators that we talk about: the killifish and the pike cichlid. So the killifish like small guppies. So if you leave guppies in a population long enough around killifish, what you'll end up with is large guppies, because the ones that the killifish don't take out are larger and therefore produce more large babies. Meanwhile, the other predator, pike cichlids, if you put guppies with pike cichlids, they mostly eat large guppies. So over time, you'll see the population of guppies get smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you're playing along at home, the question is, if I take guppies that have been raised or born from multiple generations that are smaller at sexual maturity in a pike cichlid pond, and then I put them into a killifish pond with no guppies, what will happen to the size of the guppies over time? So think about it. Give you a second to think before I tell you. And so hopefully what you're saying to yourself is, well, the pike cichlids have led to the guppies being smaller, but if I remove the pike cichlid, being smaller is no longer an advantage. Being smaller is actually death. And so what you'll see is that guppy population size will actually go back up. Now, not the individuals who were transferred, they're doomed, but their offspring that are slightly larger, those that are able to evade the predator have a better chance. And if they're a little bit larger, then you're not going to see the killifish go after them, and it will lead to larger fish over time. It's a pretty easy experiment to do simply because guppies grow so fast and mate so fast and have babies so fast. All right, now, a term you'll see a lot is the term artificial selection. Artificial selection is when humans drive selection. We choose traits that we prefer. Well, it's not always advantageous for an organism as much as it's advantageous for us. Over here we have this watermelon. This is such a fun picture. This is an original watermelon. Look, there's like no meat on this thing. It's all kind of rind and like seeds. Ew. But over time, by breeding watermelons that had more pink flesh, we ended up with watermelons that are basically all pink flesh. And even to the point that we don't even let them have seeds anymore. Nobody really wants to spit the seeds out, so let's have seedless watermelons. Well, that's not really good for watermelons. That's not what they're for. They're supposed to have tons of seeds. But we picked the fruits that would give us, well, we picked the watermelons that would give us the most flesh. All right, over here, it's kind of weird to call that flesh. Over here, we have our lovely Chinese crusted dog. And this is an actual breed of dog. But, you know, that's what we liked. So it's probably not very temperature tolerant for that dog. If it's put in a cold place, I don't think it's going to make it very long. But again, this was human cultivation. We did this. And that's because that's what worked for us. All right, so the last section here is just going to be some vocab. We're going to go back and forth on a couple evolutionary concepts. The first one is divergent versus convergent evolution. This is actually a really simple concept if you think about it. Divergent evolution is when species evolve away from a common ancestor over time. This is branching out. Organisms that are the product of divergent evolution often still share some characteristics, and the more differences they have, that's the more divergence that has occurred. So just because something doesn't look exactly the same anymore doesn't mean that it's not divergence. You look for things like anatomy clues and stuff like that. Meanwhile, convergent evolution is when certain adaptations are so good that they show up multiple times in evolution. Flying, swimming, running, these were things that were all useful. And so many, many different organisms that are really, truly not related closely at all share so many common characteristics, things like flippers and wings. But it doesn't mean that those organisms are closely related. It just means that it was a really good idea and it stuck around because it increased fitness. So, quiz time. Is this convergent or evolution? The organism on the left is a sugar glider. It's a marsupial that lives in Australia. And then the guy on the right is a rodent. We actually have these in the Americas. This is a southern flying squirrel. So the question is this convergent or divergent evolution? And if you're watching this video after the fact, which I think you are, I'm going to give you a second to think about it. All right, so if you have said that this is convergent evolution, you are correct. Even though these two organisms look so similar and they've both developed these wing flaps to help them glide along, They use the same mechanism, but they are not closely related. Marsupials and rodents are really not that close. It was just that the skin flap thing showed up twice because it was so awesome, and these animals live in completely different places. They've never even met each other. Darwinian finches. So we have big beaks and medium beaks and little beaks and tiny long beaks. Is this convergent or divergent evolution? Think for a second. If you're thinking divergent, hopefully it's not just because the last one was convergent. This is divergent. These organisms all share a close common ancestor. Their beaks are all the same thing, just different modifications of that same thing. So that would be divergent evolution. So we have a seal and we have penguins. They both have flippers. Convergent or divergent? Smooth body shapes and flippers. So this one's actually a trick question. If you're talking about flippers, then technically this is convergence. Here we have a mammal and we have a bird. They evolved separately, but having flippers and streamlined bodies was such a good adaptation that it showed up multiple times in the record. What's fascinating, though, is these animals actually share similar arm bones because they share an ancestor way back that had arms. And so you'll find there's radiuses and ulnas and humeruses and things like that in these arms. And so the arms are divergent, but the flippers are convergent. It's kind of crazy to think about. But anyway, last tricky one for a while. So now the other set of evolutionary vocab I want to go over is homologous versus analogous. So homologous structures may not look alike anymore, but they are structurally similar because they branched from a common ancestor. So down in this picture, you can see a human arm, a cat arm, a whale arm, and a bat arm. And basically, they all have the same exact bones, just in different configurations, because over time, these organisms picked up adaptations for different living situations. The cat walks on its leg, the whale swims, the bat flies, and the human uses it as an arm. But ultimately, there's a tying component to these limbs because they share the same bones, because way back, we all share a common ancestor. Now, analogous structures tend to be red herrings in evolutionary history. A lot of people jump on them thinking they're an example of relationship, but in fact, they're just kind of analogies for each other, hence the name. They may look alike, but structurally, these things are not built the same way, and that's because they didn't diverge from a common ancestor. It was just such a good idea it showed up twice. Hey, does this sound familiar? Homologous structures are generally related to divergence. Analogous structures are usually related to convergence. So don't fall for an analogous structure. Just because things have wings, just because things have flippers, just because things have legs doesn't mean that they have the same flippers and legs or the same wings. So, quiz time. Homologous or analogous? A bat and a butterfly. What do you think? Both of these organisms fly, but are their wings made the same way? A bat has bones, arms that look exactly like yours with little fingers. That little thing sticking up above the center of their wings right here, those are thumbs. Meanwhile, the butterfly has these really delicate membranous wings over these little rods, basically. Not made the same way at all, but are used the same way. So would that be homologous or analogous? Analogous. These organisms don't share a close common ancestor. Yes, they're both animals, but one is an insect and the other one is a mammal. So not really very close. Now, if you already know that, it makes it a lot easier, but sometimes you don't know when you see organisms. All right, so here's a different one. We've got homologous or analogous, a bat to a bird. So looking at wings, homologous or analogous wings. Now, if you want to get technical, the wings are analogous. These organisms came from organisms that didn't fly. They evolved wings separately. But if you look at their arms, just like the one we saw before, their arms are actually homologous. A bird's arm has the same bones for the most part as a bat's arm does. But because they share the analogous wings, but the farther back homologous structures, that tells you they are related, but much farther related than, say, a bat wing and like your arm. You're probably more closely, I mean, we know that you're more closely related to a bat than you are to a bird because we're both mammals, but just think about the arms. You have the same arm bones almost identical to a bat, other than the long stringy fingers, where the arm bones have been very much more changed in the bird. So kind of crazy, but you don't fly, right? So it gets kind of interesting. You and a bat share a better homologous structure than this bat and this bird do. All right, so finally, the last group of structures we need to talk about are vestigials. Vestigials are leftovers of things that maybe aren't used anymore for what they were supposed to be used, but by having these structures, it gives us kind of hints and clues about evolutionary background. In this case, we have a picture of a whale, and this whale happens to have hip bones. Well, why would a whale have hip bones? Whales don't have legs. Well, did they? And so you have to look back at the common ancestors of whales, and the things that led to whales had legs just like our ancestors. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, it's a mammal. We know it's a mammal. It's not a fish. It's not a shark. But it has these flippers which seem red herring-ish until you see these hip bones. So, and a lot of other things. And then I think this is actually my last vocab word, is what's known as a transitional species. This is a species that we discover that fits between what we know so far in the fossil record. So the picture here, my students know, this is Tiktaalik, and he was super important because he fills in the gap between fish and amphibians. He is a lobe-fin fish. He has a neck and ears, and that was not something that you saw in fish. And he was kind of the beginning, the precursor to the amphibian. His little eyes were on top of his head. He's kind of adorable. So anyway, that's what I have. That's all of it for tonight. If you have anything you want explained, please, please, please leave a comment, and I'll be happy to get back to it. So hopefully there's not too many confusions. My next session is going to be Evolution Part 2. Just check my YouTube channel. I'm going to aim for tomorrow night at the same time, unless my AP kids want something different. So here's some citations for my images if you really care. I got everything from all over the place, all kinds of crazy Google searches. So it's amazing what you can find on Google. All righty. That's all I have for tonight. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that. This should go back to me. There I am. And again, if you have any questions, please, please, please don't be afraid to leave something in the comments for me. Well, I know someone joined me for a little while, and hopefully the rest of you will see this after the fact. So thanks a lot. Have a good night.